Indeed, it is noon, and it is time for the elocution. We'd ask all the brethren to give their attention towards me. How'd you like that? I love this 1800s garb and the jargon. I don't know how good the jargon is, but I'm trying to get it as close as I can. Thank you so much for coming out to this. Is this our third Lenten luncheon? We were supposed to have 4, but it's our third, as we are looking at the various great reformers from several of our traditions. And today, the reformer that you're going to learn about, and I tried to dress like him as best as I could, Elder John Winebrenner, is probably the most localized and the one that you'll hear the most local history about. John Winebrenner founded a group called the Church of God in a city, and does anybody know the name of that city? Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. We are very, very local. That's right. So we're going to share with you about Winebrenner's life and a little bit about the Church of God today, and we hope that you'll find it interesting. And I hope also that it'll encourage your faith walk too, as we look at some of the principles of, biblically speaking as well, of this fellowship that I'm a part of and our folks here today. So, John Winebrenner, he was born March 25th, 1797, in Glade Valley, Maryland. That is a place, I guess, near Walkersville in Frederick County, Maryland. That's where he was born, on a farm. And his spiritual upbringing would have been through the German Reformed Church of Glade Valley. He was educated there in Frederick County, in a local schoolhouse, and also at an academy in Frederick, Maryland. And he went to college just down the road here in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Can anybody guess where that was? Dickinson College, that's right. And he felt a call to ministry sometime there, I guess, in the late 1790s, no, that wouldn't be right, I'm sorry, in the late teens, 1810s, I guess, to around 1820. And this was during a time that historians call the Second Great Awakening in America. It was a time in which it seemed the Spirit of God was moving across this nation, and many people were coming to faith in Jesus Christ. It was an amazing time indeed for the Spirit of God to be moving. And Winebrenner, he went to Philadelphia in the year 1817 to study under another pastor named Samuel Helfenstein, a German Reformed minister. He didn't go to seminary. He was actually under a mentorship with this man named Helfenstein, who mentored a number of young pastors there in Philadelphia at the Race Street Reformed Church. And one thing I'd love to know, there is an old First Reformed Church on Race Street in Philadelphia. My wife and I walked by it a couple years ago when we were in Philadelphia, and I wonder if that's the same church. I don't know, but I'm sure it's connected somehow. Well, Winebrenner completed his education, and it was time for him to find his first church. And so they did their search process as they did at that time, and it was determined that his first pastorate would be in a German Reformed church in a building that looked more like a log cabin than a church in this small town along the banks of the Susquehanna River with 3,000 people in it, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. That's where he was sent to. The name of the church was Salem German Reformed Church, and he was called to preach there every Sunday. But because preachers were in such demand at that time, he was also charged to preach at Shoop's German Reformed Church in Dauphin County, and also at Peace Reformed Church. And many of you know where that is. How many of you know where the Peace Church is on St. John's Road and Trindle Road? That was Winebrenner's church. And he was there one time every 2 weeks. So every week at Salem and Harrisburg, once every 4 weeks, I maybe didn't say that, at Shoop's, and once every 2 weeks at Peace Church. And while Winebrenner was in Harrisburg serving, there at Salem in downtown Harrisburg, they finished their brand new building. That building, Salem Reformed Church, now Salem United Church of Christ, is still there to this day at 3rd and Chestnut Street, and there is still a worshiping congregation there. You could visit there on a Sunday if you wanted to do so. But guess what? There was trouble with a capital T from day one when Winebrenner showed up in the year 1820. He was at odds with the vestry. That would be the church council at Salem in Harrisburg. And do you know what the issues were? The issues were something that Winebrenner was passionate about called the new measures. He was so passionate about seeing people come to faith in Jesus that he had new measures or new ideas to bring people into the church and bring them to Christ. Now, to be honest with you, the people at Salem were not opposed, as far as I can tell, to his theology and his evangelism and wanting people to come to Christ, but his methods, they were a little bit over the top. For example, he would hold late night prayer meetings. Sometimes they would go from 7 p.m. in the evening till 4 in the morning the next day. Wow. Fervent prayers with believers praying, and even praying with something that they called groanings in the Spirit. He also, at those prayer meetings, get this, allowed women to pray when men were present. Oh, that was the thing that really got Elder Winebrenner in a lot of trouble. And guess what? He would even reprove and call out sinners from the pulpit. In the tradition of doing that in a fun-spirited kind of way, I rebuked our kitchen crew before the meeting today just for fun, and I got a kick out of doing that. So anyway, I don't know if they liked it or not, but that's how it was. And he was so passionate to see people come to faith in Jesus that he even took some more radical steps. He introduced a concept, something called the use of the anxious bench. Now, what the anxious bench was if I understand this, there was one pew or bench in the front of the church that was reserved for those that had not yet surrendered their life to Christ. And what you could do is, if you felt that you knew that you were still a sinner, you had not given your life to Jesus, and you were struggling with that, or sometimes if it was your grandma or your neighbor that wanted you to surrender to Christ, they'd drag you up there, put you in that seat, and people would gather around you and pray over you, sometimes for an extended period of time, praying that the Spirit of God would convict you to come to Christ. Interestingly enough, a similar thing in the last church that I served up in Schuylkill County, we had an outdoor tabernacle at that church, and it got knocked down by the snow 3 years before I showed up there, and we built a new tabernacle. But in this old tabernacle, this old camp meeting place, one of the ladies that was there, the oldest member of the church, she says she remembers that in that tabernacle there was something called a mourner's bench. That's very interesting. So I'm not sure if that's the same as the anxious, but I think it was, where that was at least used to some degree at that point. It's an amazing thing. So he was too radical in his evangelism, so therefore, early in the spring of 1823, Winebrenner showed up one Sunday morning there at Salem Reformed Church at 3rd and Chestnut Streets in Harrisburg with a crowd gathered outside, but guess what? The door was locked. Nobody could get in. And do you know why that door was locked? Because they were locking him out. He was done. They had enough. The vestry said that he would no longer be their pastor, and they went through the process to have him removed, if I understand the story. So with half the congregation present, they walked down the street to the banks of the Susquehanna River. My guess it's right about across from where the Harrisburg Hospital is now. I think that's probably where they were, somewhere in that vicinity. And they had a worship service together. And at that point, the pulpit at Salem German Reformed was considered vacant, and Winebrenner was then in limbo for 2 years. He continued to be an independent preacher of sorts, but he marked his official separation. He got kicked out in 1823, and his official separation from the German Reform group was in 1825. About this time, he went on to hold worship services at various places, and they erected a building called Union Bethel there on Mulberry Street in Harrisburg. And a congregation was there and he called it the Church of God. Now, you might find this interesting. Why do we go by the name Church of God? In fact, those in the German Reform that were referring to this movement referred to this group as the Winebrennerians. But Winebrenner did not want a group named after his name, and this is what he said. Here you'll get some of this 1820 style English. Winebrenner said, "The name or title Church of God is undeniably the true and proper appellation by which the New Testament church ought to be designated. This is her scriptural and appropriate name. This and no other title is given her by divine authority. This name or title, therefore, ought to be adopted and worn to the exclusion of all others. Well,
Amen.
He didn't mean, were you sure about that, United Methodist man? And the reason for this, he was speaking biblically. If you look in the King James Version of the New Testament, it's true that the church is referred to 8 times as the Church of God and 3 times as the churches of God. So it is the most common name used in the apostolic setting in the New Testament setting for the church. Winebrenner didn't want the Church of God to be a denomination, though. He wanted it to be a movement, a re-emergence of the early church where the Spirit of God could really work. But it did become a denomination. It became an eldership, if you will, a collection of congregations that worked together as they spread from Union, Bethel, and planted new preaching stations all over the area. It spread. It began right here in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and spread pretty much where the German migration movement went, some down into Lancaster County, down south into Maryland and out to Ohio and Indiana. And we also know that as far as we can tell, and it's been researched, this is the very first group to ever take the name Church of God, founded right here in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Now, there were other individual churches before 1825 that took that name, but as far as a movement, we're the first one to take that name. Other groups take the name today. You may have heard of the Anderson Church of God. How many of you know Bill and Gloria Gaither, the singers? They're part of the Anderson Church of God. How about Sandy Patty? She was Anderson Church of God. And how about Charles Schultz? He wrote the Peanuts, Snoopy and Charlie Brown and all that. He was an Anderson Church of God person. That group grew out of us in the 1800s. There was a doctrinal split over the doctrine of holiness or entire sanctification in Ohio. And that group grew out of that. So the Anderson Church of God is like the child of the Winebrenner Church of God. Pastor Tim last week mentioned the Cleveland, Tennessee Church of God. That's a Pentecostal fellowship. But they really had no connection or roots with us in their beginnings because they're a group that emerged down south. And then we're a part of that, came about through that Azusa Street movement, as Pastor Tim described so well last week. So I say that just to let you know that probably, not because this is a big deal to be sound haughty, but it's a historical thing that right here in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, was the first denomination that took the name Church of God. And Winebrenner's Church of God grew, and it was known for its emphasis on evangelism, even locally. And they're speaking of evangelism, the evangelistic methods and meetings also often happened in camp meetings, outdoor revival settings where people would gather together sometimes for 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe I heard of some going like 8 weeks long, where every night people would come together to worship and sinners would just repent of their sin and accept Christ. It was just an amazing thing. And I can tell you one town locally here, one area, an area known in those days as White Hill, where there were revival camp meetings that took place, and they began as a group of people that followed Winebrenner that went to Peace Church over here that we mentioned earlier on St. John's Church Road. Those folks from Peace Church also became part of the Church of God, part of Winebrenner's group. And they established a congregation, and they started, see if you can figure it out, I'm going to try to give you a hint here. They started out by having meetings, and the meetings were known as the camp up on the hill. I'll say that again. The camp up on the hill. You know where I'm talking about? So the name Camp Hill comes from the revival meetings of the Church of God. In fact, if you drive by the Camp Hill Church of God, which is still there on 21st Street, there's a placard there commemorating this. We have, I know, at least one member of the Camp Hill Church of God here today. There's Phyllis Hinkle. Phyllis is a member of Camp Hill Church of God. We're talking about the oldest church in Camp Hill and part of the movement and part of the reason that White Hill became Camp Hill. So those are some interesting things. The movement grew through the Harrisburg area and, like I said, Western and wherever the Germans went. And that's basically how we spread to different parts of the country then. We do remain mainly in the Northeast and the Midwest, although we have congregations throughout the country and even in other parts of the world as well. Some distinctives of Winebrenner's Church of God, and even today, is unlike most churches, we don't have 2, but we have 3 ordinances. That seems strange, doesn't it? Now, you probably can guess 2 of the ordinances. What are, or in some of your churches, sacraments. What are some of those ordinances or sacraments we celebrate as Christians? Baptism and communion. Now, what's the third one, the weird one? Feet washing. That's Church of God, absolutely. In fact, this Sunday is an ordinance service here at Enola First Church of God. If you join us here, we will be having communion, and yes, we will dismiss and come down here to the lower level, and we will wash one another's feet. That will happen here this Sunday morning at Enola First Church of God. We still do that to this day. The eldership that formed was one that was composed of several teaching elders. Technically, to this day, not Winebrenner, but George, I'm considered a teaching elder. In fact, my Bible that was given to me at my ordination has a picture in here of Winebrenner himself, and it says, let me see this. I have the ordination as a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ and a teaching elder of the Church of God. That's the title that is given to pastors then. So those are some of the unique things. Now let's go back to Winebrenner himself. What are some things that he was all about? Well, one thing that he was big into was the temperance movement. Does anybody know what the temperance movement's all about? Yeah, alcohol. And this is drinking of alcohol. That was a big, big no-no back in the day. And to be honest with you, not to stir things up, it's still something that we discourage to this day, is the imbibing of beer, wine, and intoxicating liquors, as they said back in those days. But this was Winebrenner's take on it. He says this: with the manufacture and sale of liquors for medicinal, mechanical, and sacramental purposes, we wish not to interfere. We have no controversy with any man or party on the subject. But against the abominable liquor traffic for drinking purposes and the odious license law legalizing the traffic, we must and do declare an uncompromising warfare, and for it we know no remedy but the moral suasion and prohibition. Did you get that? In other words, they weren't crazy about the drinking of alcohol, and they were prohibitionists and temperance folks in those days. Another thing that was close to Winebrenner's heart was abolitionism. The Church of God was definitely a northern abolitionist movement. In fact, Winebrenner himself got involved in the business, as other abolitionists did at that day, with the manufacture of silkworms. Does anybody know, and it failed, but does anybody know why the abolitionists were into silkworms in the early 1800s? What's that?
Well, because cotton was the crop of the South.
Cotton was the crop of the South, and it was the hope of the abolitionists that they could starve the economy of the South by having the economy go to silk rather than cotton. And Winebrenner did have some, I understand, got into silkworms a little bit, but that failed. You can't blame the guy for trying. And there was also a movement at that time, and Winebrenner showed an interest in, I don't know if he grew these, but sugar beets. Same thing. They were hoping that if sugar beets were grown, then they could starve the southern economy of those in the deep South where sugar cane was harvested by slaves. So these were some of the things. Evangelistic preaching was a big deal too, all throughout his life. And I want to give you one story of this evangelistic preaching of Winebrenner's, and I have it here in this book that was written in his life. And I hope that you'll, I'm going to give you a guess to try to figure out where this was. This was someone who testified about Winebrenner's evangelistic preaching and the impact that it had on family members of his. A man named J.G. Fritchie, a student, rejoices in the conversion of his sister under Elder Winebrenner. And he said, "But more especially, I too rejoice that you have been made the happy instrument, Winebrenner, in the hands of King Emmanuel in stirring up a revival in that second Sodom." Does anyone want to guess where the second Sodom was? That would be Lingelstown. You wonder what was going on over there. But this man's sister, there at a revival in the second Sodom of Lingelstown, hope nobody here today is from Lingelstown, she found Christ under the teaching and the preaching of Winebrenner. So. And I just wanted to say this. You might say, well, what was it that drove someone to be maybe a little on the edge that way, fighting with his church council, the anxious bench, the preaching, and the, even dabbling into silkworms and different things, and a passion for all these things. The number one thing I believe that drove Winebrenner is what drives us today in the Church of God. It's supposed to drive us today. And that is what Jesus said to Nicodemus in John chapter 3 and verse 3. Jesus said this, "I tell you the truth, no one can see the kingdom of God unless he is born again." This concept of being born again, or Winebrenner called it regeneration or the new birth, was a big deal and remains a big deal to us today in our fellowship. We in the Church of God believes that a person is born again when he or she professes faith in Jesus Christ, truly that is, when they make that confession and they're serious about it and they have that tugging of God's Spirit on their heart and they profess faith in Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit comes in and indwells that person and they are a new creature in Jesus Christ. And just to show you how this was a major, major force in Winebrenner's life, I would like to read to you his testimony that he gives when he experienced the new birth. And it happened while he was a student in Philadelphia under Dr. Helfenstein when he was training for ministry. Believe it or not, and that's something, he was training for ministry. He would say that he was a sinner. He was not a true Christian, even when he was called into ministry, until that time in which he sat under Helfenstein's teaching and the Spirit of God convicted his heart. It's a beautiful testimony. Listen to it. This is what he says. He says, "Hence, I continued sinning and repenting for a number of years, till in the winter of 1817, when deep and pungent convictions laid hold of my guilty soul. Then, like Job, I abhorred myself. Like Ephraim, I bemoaned myself. With the prodigal, I said, I will arise and go to my father. And with the publican, I cried, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And after chattering like the swallow, and mourning as a dove, for 3 or 4 weary months, my poor woe-fraught soul found redemption in Emmanuel's blood, even the forgiveness of sins. It was on Easter Sabbath in the city of Philadelphia, in the presence of a large congregation of worshipers, that Jesus, the Son of Righteousness, arose and shone upon my soul with healing in his wings. Truly, that was the happiest day of my life. My darkness was turned into day, and my sorrow into joy. Jesus became the joy of my heart and the center of my affections. His people became lovely and precious in my sight. His word was my delight. In it I beheld new beauties and beatitudes. Sin, that dreadful monster, became more odious and hateful to my soul. Zion's welfare lay near my heart. My bowels yearned for the salvation of sinners. I was in travail for my friends and kindred. I felt constrained to join with the Spirit and the bride and say to all, Come, oh come to Jesus. And that's his testimony of how he was born again. It's a beautiful testimony. I love it every time I read it or it's read at an event. Well, today, like I said, we in the churches of God believe that one is born again by confessing sincerely Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord. And one of the scriptural passages we use as foundation to that's a foundation of that is Romans 10:9, which says, if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. We call this professional or confessional regeneration. For me, not John, but George, it happened for me on January 22nd, 1978. I don't have a dramatic story like Pastor Tim told us last week. I was merely 8 years old, and I was with my family in our sitting room, in our living room, in our parlor, and I knew that this is what I need to do, and I prayed to receive Jesus. I didn't have a dramatic experience like Winebrenner did, but I knew at that point that he was with me, and I know that he is with me to this day. Others throughout church history have had experiences more or less dramatic. You Methodists that are here today, what happened to John Wesley at Aldersgate Street? His heart was strangely warmed whenever he received the new birth. Now I know that many of you come from Christian traditions that teach baptismal regeneration, and that is one is born again at his or her baptism. And many of you will cite 1 Peter 3:21 that says, "And corresponding to that, baptism now saves you, not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ." I'm not trying to twist your arm or convince you of one way or the other, whether you believe in baptismal regeneration or in professional or confessional regeneration. But could I at least ask all of you to consider this? Wouldn't it be a wonderful thing if every person who calls themselves to be Christians had a dynamic, live, active faith such that, like Elder John Winebrenner, he couldn't help to go to the limits to serve Jesus and to be a blessing to others? How would our churches be today if we all had that kind of a zeal? May God bless you, brethren. It is near the 1 o'clock hour. Many of you need to depart. I now end this elocution, and I thank you all for gathering here today. It has been a blessing to gather with you at the Bethel, at the Church of God in Enola.